Welcome to the Biotech Startups podcast by Xcelience. Join us as we speak with first-time founders, serial entrepreneurs, and experienced investors about the challenges and triumphs of running a biotech startup, from pre-seed to IPO, with your host, John Chi. In our last episode, we spoke with Derek Hennecke about the early challenges and financial hurdles he faced after moving to Europe for his MBA and his first role in business development. We also touched on his transition to managing, learning the ropes of leadership, and his joint venture experience in Mexico. Lastly, we discussed the intricacies of managing a matrix organization and his experience as a product manager. If you missed it, be sure to go back and give part 2 a listen. In part 3, we talk with Derek about his transition from commercial roles to full operations, managing a challenging site in Egypt, and the teamwork that turned it all around. We'll also touch on his move to a Biologics site in Montreal and the significant hurdles he faced there. Lastly, we'll discuss the entrepreneurial journey of buying out a business and founding Xcelience.
And so now you expanded LATAM. And you mentioned being in India as well. When did you know it was time to leave this role and move on to your next?
Well, it was hard economically to move as being the king as an expat to going back to headquarters financially. But the main thing was I wanted to really move full on into operations. I'd done commercial, done R&D, business development, sales, product development, product management, but the pure line of operations was a hard thing to break into. It's usually very siloed. You do this, or you do finance, or you do operations, and to switch over into another field is pretty hard. But I caught the attention of the president of operations and said, "I'd really like to work in your organization." And he said, "Why would you want to do that?" Because I want to try that out. I want to try it out either.
Yeah. Well, I need more than that from you.
Roll the dice.
Yeah, I need more.
Yeah. So that's you can't say that either. But he was willing to take a chance, and luckily there was a operation in Egypt that they were wanting to shut down. Egypt was not in the strategy of the network. You had Mexico, China, India, Delft, Spain. Those were, in the strategy to continue. Egypt was not. So I think he said, "Well, why don't you go to Egypt? Nothing. You can't do any harm. We're going to shut it down." And I also at the time, I know this in hindsight. I didn't know at the foresight, but it was when DSM was going to buy Crispocadis, and they were very, very different cultures. And sometimes it's good to be in with change, but I think that I wouldn't have known how the winds were blowing and how things would work out. So it was a good time for me to be outside of the tropical storm that was happening with that merger.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Globetrotting. Okay, so now you guys are moving to Egypt. Can you talk a little bit about what was that move like for you? Hopefully you didn't lose your luggage.
No, but it's funny when you moved. I don't know if it's the case now. When you move to Egypt, you have to, everything you bring into the country, you have to take out. So every TV or phone, they take the serial number down, and even if it breaks while you're living there, you have to make sure that you register it when you're leaving. Otherwise, it looks like you're importing electronic goods. Yeah. So. Whoa. We didn't lose anything, but we did not lose anything.
Yeah. This time with serial numbers, tracking it all the way.
We had a great time. Also in the Netherlands, we had another child. We had one child in Mexico. We had a second child on the return visit to the Netherlands. So now we were bringing 2 children to live with us in Egypt. But we had a wonderful time. 7,000 years of history. Every weekend, going to another pyramid or another settlement to explore the country culturally and personally. I really enjoyed it. When I arrived, I met with the management team and told them they knew that we were kind of on the cutting block, that we might not have a future. And yet they pulled it together. And Hassan Al Sayed, but especially Ahmed Fouad, the head of R&D and the head of production, and myself and the finance guy that came with me, the four of us, we kind of pulled it together. And the site stayed in operation for many years until maybe 6-7 years ago. I think they finally did cut it, but it got another lease for another over 10 years. So, and Ahmed Fouad is doing very well in the network. He's now himself an expat. He moved to Mexico and then India or China, and now he's in India. So
wow. And can you talk a little bit about that experience? It sounds like you were brought in and you had to turn around the franchise. Like,
yeah.
What was your experience doing that?
I think it was about teamwork and pulling people together and brainstorming ways we could improve the performance, the safety, the quality, and the cost structure. We had those three main things. If you didn't have the safety, you could also be shut down. If you didn't have the quality, of course you would be shut down. And if you couldn't be viably financially, you also had challenges. Again, with stakeholders, I had now had a product manager. You may remember that matrix. So I was this level.
Yeah.
And the product manager, Marcel Veltrup, he was managing the matrix. And he was the one I was negotiating with to say, well, how about if we make this quality? And he said, well, if you made this quality, I'd find these customers for you. And so he took a risk and a chance on us. And then my direct boss, Roelof Mulder, was a dyed in the blue, longtime operations guy. And he didn't understand why this guy came from outside of operations into his organization. He really supported me. And again, stakeholders, trying your best, enthusiasm, the team coming to bring the team together. One innovation was Ahmed Fouad. He saw one of the reasons we were losing money was the release of isopropanol in distillation. We were losing too much. So he went back and cracked open the textbooks and we were trying to understand how we could improve the performance of the distillation columns. And that was one factor that got us to profitability. So.
That's incredible. And my father's an engineer, but he still talks about sometimes when he like gets to like this like unique problem, he'll still crack open the textbooks.
Yeah.
You really just, I'm like, you're still doing this. Like I think, and these are like books that like, ancient. Like he had in his like ancient grad school books that he had. He's like, I still use them. They're great. He's like, you're not taking these away from me. So I love hearing that. And so, now and I know this site in Egypt also got pretty sizable. Like you had like you scaled it up. Oh, correct me if I'm wrong. You scaled it up to like, over like 200 people. Can you talk a little bit about that?
It was mostly due to being able to export again. Mexico, of course, we'd cover the Egyptian market, and then improving the quality to be able to have outside export markets. We finally got access to Europe, so that helped. But I think that the main thing was concentrating on those three things rather than the expansion. The expansion would have happened. The growth will happen if you figure what the main drivers are to your business. And I don't think I ever focus on the growth, but rather what is important is the customers, providing a good product, having good safety for my employees. I'm more proud about the safety for the employees that we did.
Absolutely.
At the time, hepatitis C was a rampant disease in the population, and so we brought in systems to help them with that. I think that was it, so that we'd be talking to the families of the employees and say, well, look, we want you to send your husband home or your wife home, or mostly husband, home safely. That was new for them. So.
And I love that what you said about growth. It's the growth will come if you're focusing on the team and the customer. And growing for growth's sake is not necessarily what you should be optimizing for. Because at the end of the day, it's kind of like the success will follow, regardless of what the growth vector is. And I love hearing that, like just like focusing on the team, making sure that they are health taken care of and their well-being is super critically important. And so after, you've spent some time in Egypt, I believe you ended up moving back to Canada
Right.
when you became a site director. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So again, now it had 2 or 3 big successes, and the big next one was to move back to the Netherlands and manage the largest site, the Delft site, and that would have been a big change. It was a large population, large site, very much of a governance job rather than a P&L responsibility, because you've got the local community around you. So I wasn't sure I wanted to go in that direction. I like the block and tackle, the business part of it, but mostly, while I could speak pretty well Dutch, there you've got to know the slang. You gotta, if you hear something in the corner of your ear, you got to know. If you only hear 1 out of every 10 words, you better know what's going on. So very much felt uncomfortable about that. And it would be at such a point in the company that I'd be staying there for the rest of my life more in the Netherlands. And I wanted to move back to North America at that point. So they found me a good job in Montreal to manage a biologics site. And I thought, great, I've got 2. I have 3 things. So I get back to North America, Montreal, which is a fantastic city. I don't know, have you been there, John?
Yes, I have. Love it.
It's so much fun. So it's such a beautiful city, and I loved it. And then into biologics. So going back to molecular biology.
Cool.
I thought this is a winner. It didn't quite turn out that way.
Yeah. Talk a little bit about that, if you can. Like,
sure.
What, going in, it's like this, it checks all the boxes. And then how did it not check the boxes for you when you ultimately were there?
That's something that you live long enough, you're going to have some failures. And this was definitely a failure. The site was subject to a lot of contaminations. It was not built properly. It had gone through 2 site directors before me, but I didn't have the skills or the ability to turn it around. And after I left, they had 1 more site director who failed, and then they shut the place down. So, but that's when I decided I had to leave the company, because it didn't work out, and that's what happens. So
yeah, and I think, and I love the kind of the candidness and about that. It's just like it's not always up and to the right. And sometimes at least you can feel like your previous performance will be indicative of your future performance.
Yeah,
and
you project
sometimes it's just not that. It's not in the cards. And I mean, it must have been painful, and it's not, after, because it sounds like, these previous sites were just like just humming after, you getting there. And this one just like, oh, crap.
Yeah, it is. And I think that I'm glad to have done it. I'm glad to have gone through it. It's one of the cliches that you want to hire somebody who's had failures. I think that was good, because then you rather that they have the failure on somebody else's payroll.
Yeah.
Or payroll, because if somebody reaches far enough, they are going to have a setback, and that's what happened. But we took on the wrong projects. We took on the wrong customers. It was a shared responsibility. Absolutely, it's in a big company. No one person takes all the decisions and takes all the responsibility. But it was not easy leaving. I had a chance to go back to the Netherlands with my tail between my legs, pretty much. And I said, no, I'm not going to spend the next 10 years rehabilitating my reputation. I'll find a new home over here. And I'm so glad I did, as how things turned out. Other lessons, I think, is really say no if you believe that something's not going to work. I said no, but maybe I didn't say no hard enough, like no, or I quit. I should have done that, because in the end, it's going to happen anyway. You're going to be leaving anyway, so leave under your own terms. But that's what I learned. And
that is something that took a long time for me to get that muscle, is to be able to like emphatically say no. In the very beginning, early days, you just want to say yes, like all the time. You just want to say yes. And
you're not a quitter, right?
Yeah, exactly. No way. And sometimes it is the right move to say no, and that's totally okay. And I think, something else that stood out to me about that experience from what I'm hearing, and it resonates with me, is and again, not to poo-poo on MBAs too much, but it's like, it's hard to teach those kinds of lessons, if not impossible, without just getting your hands dirty and feeling that pain firsthand. And I kind of like, my saying internally is like, I can tell you how hot fire is, but you don't actually know how hot fire is until you touch it for yourself. Yeah. Like on paper, it's very hot. Yeah. And they're like, yeah, John, whatever. And I'm like, I promise you it's hot. But you only truly learn when you build up that scar tissue. Because and one of the experiences for me was, one of our early clients was basically a part of Quest. And this was like when this was our first really, like, stakes were very, very high. And before that, we had customers that were a little bit here, a little bit there, a little bit here, a little bit there. And here, we're running, patient specimen like weekly all the time. So like a lot, clinicians are relying on this. And we outfit the lab, in like the next week, everything breaks.
Oh no, why? How?
We basically realized, so it was a robotic system. And here's the part that was very hard for us to navigate, because, from our perspective, there's like various stakeholders. There's the lab, the folks in the lab using the instrumentation. And then there's we also have to work closely with the makers of the equipment. And just somewhere there might have been a miscommunication. Don't know who, and we don't need to point fingers, but just like perhaps the way the robotics were set up, or perhaps the use of a type of pipette channel might have not been the right type of pipette channel, and it just wasn't working. And they weren't able to properly validate it due to all these like kind of issues with the robotics. And so that was a lesson in stakeholder management that I now know and I'm super hypersensitive to, is making sure that that's why I kind of really stood out to me what you mentioned about communication, is making sure that at all times there are no or at least as best as possible, there are no miscommunications, such that because in the moment there was a lot of finger pointing. And if I could redo it, we could have like prevented all of that if we were like, let's just get in a room and like, get this ironed out, try to do more preventive measures here. And also the other aspect too is exactly what you said. With a small company at that time, we were very small, I think, sub 10 people. It was the first time having to have like where the buck stops with me, and like I was getting calls from like management up at like
management request.
Yeah, and I was like, okay, like this now I need to like bring my A game here and make sure. And this was over a decade ago, but still carried with me to this day, like the importance of like getting ahead of it with communication, making sure there's like stakeholder alignment, the communication channels are clear, and also what it means to have that, exactly you said, like this white glove service when it comes to, and kind of not feeling like you are working with this nameless, organization where when things really get rough, we're all in, hands on, trying to make it right. So I went on a little bit of a tangent there, but there are these formative moments that hurt like hell, like and sleepless nights, because when you're small, like you have customer concentration.
Right.
You're like, ooh, if this doesn't work out, this could be make or break. So, the school of hard knocks, these are just some like, lessons I carry with me to this day.
What's interesting about Montreal, though, there was no way we could have done more communication. It was incredible. I thought, well, just communication. The lesson is sometimes even with communication, bad stuff happens.
That too.
In the last 6 months, we had somebody from the Netherlands was seconded into my management team at a high level, whose only job was to make PowerPoint slides.
Oh, no.
Only job. So I don't know how we could have done more communication. So he was with me. Okay, well, here's the deck I made. Here's the explanation. Here's the plans. And he was earning like $120,000 a year. So high level, That was back in 2004 or 2003 dollars. So sometimes even with communication and it just, it's hard. And I mean that, that's life, it's stuff, we didn't know COVID was going to happen, or maybe we didn't know the recession of 2010 was going to happen. In hindsight, we could have done things to avoid those maybe, but we don't see them coming.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's, that is a perfect asterisk that I definitely want to highlight here. Even with excellent communication, I don't know the counterfactual, but it's everything could have still broke. But you would hope that you would increase the likelihood of success.
Yeah.
But sometimes it's not in the cards. And it just doesn't work out. So after you're like, okay, I need to move on. This is not the right environment for me. I'm not going back to headquarters for 10 years. Did you know what was next?
No, I didn't. I took 3 months off and did a lot of skiing, cross-country skiing.
Sweet.
Looked at the health, and now we had a third baby in Montreal, so spent time with her and the family. And then local management of MDS Pharma had heard of what I was doing, and obviously saw that there was still potential in me to make me the vice president of all of the GMP operations of that company. And so within about 3 months, I had a job offer, and we were moving again from. Well, this is funny. They said you're going to manage Montreal, a site in Montreal, a site in Tampa, and a site in Seattle, Bothell, Washington. And I said, that's great. I get to go to Tampa a few times. That's kind of fun. And they said, no, you're going to be posted there because that's where we want you to be located. So came home and told the family, especially my two older daughters, they said that Daddy's got a job at Disney World.
Yeah. There you go. Yeah, the perfect sale. The perfect sale. You're like, it's like, oh yeah, this is going to be perfect. Yeah. Amazing.
So that I'm over.
Yeah. And so you're now in Florida. And can you talk a little bit about the opportunity at MDS and the work that you did there and the responsibilities that you kind of were tasked with?
Yeah, so there were 3 different business units. One was a QC testing laboratory in Montreal that did CMC testing of raw materials and finished products, but the business model was only for Quebec. So they had low labor cost, but also extremely low pricing, and it was very unprofitable. The operation in Tampa was to do formulation development of phase 1 materials for oral solid dosage form clinical trials. And then the operation in Bothell, Washington was a biosafety testing, mycoplasma operation, cell banking, pretty small. So all 3 units were GMP underneath the umbrella of a strategy of being a follow the molecule CRO all the way through. And the strategy, of course, it sounds good on paper, but nobody's asking for that. Nobody's asking that you do the material production, the clinical trials, the logistics, and the data management. I think PPD is Fisher is trying to do it now with PPD, but in general, you have different business unit, different decision-making units. So the strategy was poor. And then MDS also had a poor execution. They bought all these operations which were all over the world and they weren't connected. So the interaction between the business units wasn't flowing either. Within 1 year of arriving, my boss comes to me and says, we're going to sell your 3 units. Because I'm only 1 year into the job, I think, well, I'm a GMP guy, meaning good manufacturing practice for your listeners. That doesn't have a role in a CRO. So I'm probably also out of a job. And I come home to tell my wife that too. But in that year, we were starting to turn things around. We didn't have responsibility for sales. So my boss was all pure operations and I was pure operations. And then in a matrix structure, we had sales. So this is an example where the matrix was not performing because there was no sales coming. They were more interested in sales of large clinical trials rather than small clinical materials. So I wasn't getting any sales. And so my boss, Robert Belland, he was, working at the stage of trying to bring it more to a business unit structure where I would have sales. And in a couple of months just before we were sold, we we were able to bring sales into our unit. So that helped. Started to help.
Interesting. And it sounds like were matrix organizations, was that like the go-to org structure? Like,
in big companies, it is. It is. Yeah. It's the case in, I won't name the big companies, but in all the big companies, it is more of a matrix structure to allow a level of entrepreneurship and decision making of some level at a lower scale with people who know the market. But it leads to these difficulties to make strategic decisions because so many stakeholders have to be involved.
Interesting. And so a year in, you're brought with this news. How did you how did you proceed from there?
Yeah, it was certainly sad, I thought, because you're just brand new into a new country with no network, and at a pretty high level now. So how are you going to find a new job? Basically, you have no experience. Remember, I had that failure in Montreal, so that could probably carry along with me. So I went back to my wife and also to an entrepreneur group here in Tampa, and I said, "This happened. If you guys know of a job, I'd love to have a job." And they all said, "Well, why don't we buy one or all three of the units? Why don't you buy one or all three of the units?" And I said, "Really? Like, how am I going to do that?"
Yeah. It's like, oh, it's that simple.
Really, that easy?
Like we can just do that. Like, what do you mean? What do you mean?
And they said, "Don't worry about that. First, decide if you want to be an entrepreneur. That's the first thing. Understand and think about it. And then if that's the motivation you do, then cross the next. Just take it step by step, because you can't be, we can only hold one idea in our head at a time. And if you try to have two or three ideas in the head at the same time, they start to conflict with each other. They start to merge. So we had a long conversation, and again, it was my wife, but also our head of sales. He also, Randall Guthrie, he had just recently been moved into my unit, and he said, "Hey, let's why don't we buy it?" So I had his support, and this entrepreneurial group said, "You could probably do it," and we came up with ideas. We went through a sales process to sell the 3 units, and we found a couple of buyers for the Tampa unit, one buyer for the Seattle unit. Because of the 3 different business units, they wouldn't be one buyer that buy all 3. It'd be 3 separate ones. The final best price in for the Tampa operation was such that I said, "Well, I think I have ways to be able to make that work. I can do what's called a sale-leaseback. I can use the operating capital from the customers to buy it, and then a little bit of seller finance. So a whole bunch of combinations, and my own money, but I didn't have much to be able to pull it together." So we can talk about that. I don't know which way
I'm really interested in that aspect. Very interested. Like, the first thing that comes to mind is like, was there kind of kind of startup entrepreneurship bug kind of lingering under the surface for you? Or was this like at this point where it's just like, raise your hand, let's do it? And how did that conversation go with your wife?
Well, my wife came from an entrepreneurial family as well, so she was pretty supportive of it. We had a small company in the Netherlands that she ran, making websites for companies and presentations. Actually, back then it was hard to make a presentation, so you'd actually hire people to make presentations. And so she ran that, and we had experience with using QuickBooks and that. So that got the bug in us to say that this would work, and we had confidence. We knew that we were turning the place around, and this is another factor of big companies. Once they've made a decision, there's no going back on it. Even though it would be better for them to wait a year, to wait till we have good results, which they even knew was going to come. But MDS had an activist investor who said, "No, we're out. We don't, just get rid of these things. They're a distraction." So I knew I was going to get a good deal. I knew that we would be able to go to the customers and say, "You don't want us to fail. You want us to be successful. So work with us." Things like that. So it was
interesting.
It wasn't as risky as, say, moving to a new country, I think.
Yeah.
In many ways.
that's really interesting too. And this is a, form of company building that, a lot of our listeners perhaps are kind of fall more into like the kind of like venture, have an idea, get venture money, and they kind of go that route. But I love hearing these stories of a kind of a different way of company building and entrepreneurship, where it's perhaps a group within a larger organization, and the larger company or the top co makes a decision for whatever reason, right or wrong, maybe a forced seller, or there's something in the market, he's like, or the tides have changed or something, management's changed and the strategy has changed, and presents an opportunity for someone like yourself to be like, we can make this work. We can make this work. And so can you just talk a little bit about, like, sounds like you got the green light, you got the thumbs up from, sales team, your family, the investors. What was, one, what were the early days like? What was your just ground zero? What was it like?
Yeah, we didn't have many investors. The only one we had was the head of sales, and then the realtor who, instead of taking a commission, he helped me find a landlord to do the sale and lease back. So
cool.
At Duffy. So he was really good. And at the beginning, it was very scary. Of course, you didn't know what legal would be, you didn't know what marketing would be, or any unknown costs. The asset purchase agreement that I signed with the company was very limited in the rights and warranties that I would have as a buyer for the company. And that was why they sold it to me too, because they said, well, if we sell it to the guy who's running it, he will not be able to come back and sue us because he's been running it. He knows all the stuff. He'll have no rights in court to sue. So that was a factor that led in my favor as well. But that meant that, there could be something I didn't know. I'd only been running it for a year. So at the beginning, it was very scary, and we built up a lot of cash just to be ready. We end up having a couple of years than we expected, but we were still waiting for the other shoe to fall, and that something would come up that we didn't expect, like what are taxes? It's all the stuff. Things you don't know. Yeah. So we also went to the customers, and this is another factor of big companies. Big companies don't. They have a separate group doing collections. And John, you know that you know what your collections are and what your AR is every single week. You know what your AP is every week because you got to make payroll. But big companies don't do that. And we had outstanding payables up to 2 years where customers said not. Yeah. Yeah. And so I called the customers and said, do you know you have this? And said, maybe they did, maybe they didn't. And I said, well, you don't want me to go bankrupt because your trial is then going to fail. So I'd like you to pay it. And so I got a lot of the working capital that way too, where the customer started rolling that money in that was due to me. Now, when you buy a company, you buy those receivables. They are receivables, but because they were overdue for so long, they were worth nothing according to the negotiation that we had. So that also helped me to find money that was lying in the walls, as they say in the Netherlands. There's money there. You just got to pull it out.
That's really, and I love that. This is kind of like the thing where it's just like rolling up your sleeves, and we talk about it. It's like just unconventional ways to finance, a business. Like, again, and I don't mean to be overly prescriptive. Like, being in San Francisco, the Bay Area, it's a very venture-oriented way of financing your business. Right. And for us at Xceder, we're a form of credit, and we're an odd duckling. Like, we're super weird. Yeah, it's super weird. Like, every time we talk to, a company that comes from that venture mold, they're like, what the heck? I'm like, but in my head, I'm like, credit is like one of the oldest businesses known to humans. it's like it's been around. And so, but I love this too, where it's like scrapping it together with kind of when the big company had just basically written off all the receivables. You're like, no. These, like, there's actually something here. And all it took was like picking up the phone. I might be oversimplifying the collections process.
Well, it's pretty simple. Yeah. Yeah.
That's
It was
really
pretty simple.
fascinating.
Yeah, because they weren't, the customer wasn't trying to cheat you. Then they want you to be successful, right? It's a partnership, and it's not transactional. It's not like you're buying a car once from a lot. You're going in your business too. You're going to do a lease, and then you're going to do more with the same company, especially Quest, for example.
Yep.
So they want you to be successful, and when they realize what the situation is, I think it was simpler than, it was as simple as you say, John.
That's very cool. And something like the kind of saying I mentioned internally, it's just that with this kind of a business where you're relying on cash flows and from customers, your customers are your investors. It's kind of what you're like. They have a vested interest in making sure that your company thrives so they can thrive. So you're on the same boat. And I think that's when you find that alignment, it is beautiful. And you can really start to, because you guys are all in the same boat, you can start moving in bigger and faster ways. As long as you're finding, you're not selling, a lackluster product. As long as they're succeeding, you're succeeding. And okay, so now you've managed to pull together the capital. You got sale-leaseback from the real estate folks. Can you talk about the, and on the pronunciation, is it Xcelience?
Yeah, very well. Thank you. Yep.
Of course. Right. Yeah, I get, so for Xceter, it's the X sound. Sometimes we get Exeter. I'm like, close. And sometimes the early days when we were making our website, we are doing an analysis of names, and the first thing that come up with Excedrin, and I'm like, and I was like, oh no, did we just pick the wrong domain and name? This is gonna be bad. We can't beat Excedrin. This is so talk a little bit about now that you've secured the financing, it sounds like you got your core kind of unit, the mission and focus, and really about the early days behind your company.
Yeah, it was great. We had a differentiating technology that we had bought from Capsugel called Xcelience, and people think it has similarity with the name. We were lucky that it did, but it wasn't the original reason why we called our company Xcelience. But it helped us. It's because Xcelience, Capsugel was selling the machines, and we would buy a machine. We were the first one to buy a machine as a service provider, and then provide the service on the machine. And the machines were expensive, so we benefited from being able to get all that work that instead of buying a machine, they could use the service, which is a recurring model. A couple of our current companies do that now. Experic does that, where it has an investment from Harold Hofflinger, that makes very good encapsulation machines, but sometimes the customer cannot afford it, or it takes a long time to put one in place, and then we provide the service. So it is a very good, viable business model that maybe one of your listeners can do. If they see a piece of equipment, they can buy it and then provide the service on it. I can imagine it happens nicely in the Bay Area too.
Yep, absolutely. And I think especially with after the 2020, 2021 kind of time where there's helicopter money, and now it's all about efficiency. How can we do this efficiently? And I think you were talking about it too, and I in a previous role where kind of each kind of phase or stage of growth, you're finding specialist help.
Yeah.
And that's a way to make sure that you are, perhaps it's not the wisest thing to do to just build all this capacity in-house. Some things maybe, but
more strategic, but
yeah. But sometimes it's definitely worth it to find experts out there who have the instrumentation and expertise to do X for you on a kind of a fractional basis.
That's all for this episode of the Biotech Startups podcast. We hope you enjoyed our conversation with Derek Hennecke. Tune in to part 4 of our conversation to learn more about his journey. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, leave us a review, and share it with your friends. Thanks for listening, and we look forward to having you join us again on the Biotech Startups podcast for part 4 of Derek's story. The Biotech Startups podcast is produced by Xcelience. Don't want to miss an episode? Search for the Biotech Startups podcast wherever you get your podcasts and click subscribe. Xcelience provides research labs with equipment leases on founder-friendly terms to support paths to exceptional outcomes. To learn more, visit our website www.excedr.com. On behalf of the team here at Xcelience, thanks for listening. The Biotech Startups podcast provides general insights into the life science sector through the experiences of its guests. The use of information on this podcast or materials linked from the podcast is at the user's own risk. The views expressed by the participants are their own and are not the views of Xcelience or sponsors. No reference to any product, service, or company in the podcast is an endorsement by Xcelience or its guests.